As a person who has made a career out of teaching classical languages, you might be surprised to learn that I didn't formally study a foreign language until graduate school. During my undergraduate studies as a biblical studies major, I began to consult various commentaries on the texts we were analyzing in class, and I began to see how important the original languages were for proper understanding. Something as simple as Paul using the second person plural pronoun for you all instead of the singular you was left unexpressed in English, and yet this was paramount for grasping his letters. The men who wrote the commentaries, I felt, were far better suited to unpack the language than I would ever be. And that is why I decided to go to graduate school, to begin the education and language training that I believed was lacking in me. When I got to graduate school, let's see if this will work here. There we go. When I got to graduate school, I felt I had a lifetime's worth to catch up on. So I suddenly found myself taking concurrently Greek, Latin, German, and Syriac. Syriac is basically late Aramaic, the mother tongue of Jesus, but written in cursive script. My vocabulary, and therefore my storehouse of thoughts and ideas, was beginning to expand into foreign territories after just the first few lessons. This process was much like foreign travel as a tourist. I was becoming like one who could get around in another context and benefit greatly from such an experience, but was still very much a native of my own land and was always returning there. In my non-language courses, I observed that many technical terms in the study of religion, which was my graduate major, were left in the language of origin. I was now able to take tours into these languages with my limited but expanding knowledge, and I'll tell you of my first notable encounter. If you have ever heard of the hypothetical Q document, which is supposedly the source text of all the synoptic gospels, then you might know that it is called the Q document rather than the S document because it is a German solution conveyed by a German word, namely Quelle. Even in English, as I learned, specialists kept the German Quelle shortened to Q when speaking about the way that the gospels came into being. The Q document was a solution. A solution to what? The synoptic problem. And before I could engage the so-called synoptic problem, I needed to know what synoptic meant. Synoptic, as I learned, comes from a Latinized Greek term which means seen together. Think of optical, or the current popular term optics, with soon synthesize, synonym, etc. In other words, synoptic refers to the three gospels which are most similar, or seen together, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. They are so synoptic that it is assumed they derive from a common source, or to say it in German again, a common Quelle. In just my few weeks of taking classes on German, Greek, Latin, and Syriac, and with my expensive textbooks, grammars, and dictionaries in hand, I felt that an entire new world or worlds was opening before me. I felt I was acquiring the tools to unlock what had been a mystery just before. The major investment was the time I put into class and homework assignments, not to mention the several hundreds of dollars I had spent on the books. At this point, I felt empowered, being able to thumb through my dictionaries and see the real and precise meaning behind things. I became addicted to tracing the origins of all the technical terms I encountered in my research, meticulously piecing things together as if completing a puzzle. It was helpful, but it would be years until I felt at home in any foreign language. These initial encounters were greatly intensified by my understanding of the important terms in their original languages. However, there was no real interaction with the languages themselves through tourism. At this stage in the adventure, I was constantly translating individual words necessarily into my own intrinsic mode of thought. But, however, no longer did I passively approximate meanings of technical terms. I nailed them down, tracing them usque ad fontes, or all the way to the sources. This was very enlightening, yet I felt I was still missing what the commentary writers from my college days had. They had seemed to be reading with ease in Greek and Hebrew. I could spend half an hour on the etymology of just one word, making it understandable in English using other English words. I was, in the end, and it is a very rewarding thing, simply a tourist. I wanted, however, to acquire the skills to live inside another language, to be a part of another world. I could have remained a language tourist, but I felt unsatisfied. I remember talking to my teachers about this, always hounding them for advice for improvement. It was late one evening after an advanced Greek course that one of my teachers said to me in his office, "There has to be a point when you really make the language your own." And it wasn't until 2 years later, when I was no longer a language student, as I was sitting in a coffee shop in Germany, that I opened my Greek New Testament and worked my way through an entire chapter, not as an assignment, but under my own personal volition, Matthew chapter 1. Abraham was the father of Isaac, and Isaac the father of Jacob, and Jacob the father of his brothers, etc., etc. Or in King James, Abraham begat Isaac, and Isaac begat Jacob, and Jacob begat Judas and his brethren. Or in ancient Greek, Abraham egenesen ton Isaac, Isaac de egenesen ton Jacob, Jacob de egenesen ton Judan, kaitus adelphus autu. Nearly the entire chapter is a name begat a name, Abraham egenesen ton Isaac. But I read it. There was no longer a teacher to validate that I was seeing things correctly. I simply knew I was hitting the mark. I knew the Gospel of Matthew well in English, and in some ways I was imitating, using that prior knowledge to understand the Greek text. But I discovered reading in Greek was like conversing face to face with a figure I'd only seen in sketches and postcards. There was no intermediary, no teacher, and no translation on which to rely. The language was revealing itself and validating my understanding. It was speaking with me. Who knows how many hours I sat there, but still I had read an entire chapter of New Testament Greek. I reread it several more times before I left, elated in my successful afternoon of study. Was I beginning to make the language my own? The next day, I read chapter 2 at the same coffee shop. In a few weeks, or possibly even months, and with countless shots of espresso under my belt, I had read the entire Gospel of Matthew. I was no longer a student completing assignments for class. I was putting my skills to use. I wondered about my classmates and whether they were still reading Greek. Continual practice, even outside the classroom, was the key. I was no longer on a guided tour of New Testament Greek, but was now visiting that world as often as possible alone and staying long enough to make friends and memories there. Soon I turned my attention to the book of Philemon, or as some people say, Philemon, Paul's shortest letter. I was already beginning my commentary on the Greek text of that book, which would later become the longest chapter of my dissertation, although I didn't realize it at that time. I read Philemon's 25 verses every day for a week, my major concerns being, why had Paul written this letter, and why is it in our New Testament? Before I had even consulted the commentaries, I had the Greek text virtually memorized and was ready to engage all the theories surrounding this mysterious letter. Now, whenever I thought of Philemon, I only thought of the Greek text. I couldn't even remember how it read in English. Most notable was verse 12, where Paul uses the word anapempo to indicate what he has done with the slave in that book. Against the opinion of almost all biblical scholars, I concluded that Paul had referred the slave to the master's judgment. In other words, Paul was asking for Onesimus's, the slave's, freedom. In English, there is no way to infer this. English and every other language besides Greek says, I have sent him back to you, rather than, I have referred him to your decision. But I was certain of my translation, and eventually found other writers who saw things the same way I did. The purpose of the entire letter and its subsequent preservation and inclusion in the New Testament canon seemed to be established by my analysis of it, and the analysis stemmed completely from Greek. I realized the true occasion for Philemon cannot be ascertained in any other language but Greek. I was beginning to realize that I could not trust the translations of important texts. Following this experience with the Greek New Testament, whenever I read a biblical passage in English, I would wonder and anticipate what the Greek might say. If I saw something like Abraham was the father of Isaac, I would think more deeply about it. I'd organize my thoughts around questions such as, I wonder if there's actually an active verb used here, most likely. It's probably in the aorist tense with an accusative article before the direct object. I would speculate about that world and could go visit it, go see it anytime I wanted simply by opening my Greek Bible. Nearly every time I walked into the theological library at the university where I did my doctoral studies, there were students and teachers reading Greek and Hebrew. They were engaged, as I was, with primary things, and we could meet on that equalizing plane in the realm of the original languages, where both English and German had become secondary. At that point, it wasn't relevant for me to read Latin extensively. I was indeed making a language my own, and Greek was winning the day for me. Latin, as much as I loved it, was squarely in second place. As I learned until the work of St. Thomas, Latin never achieved what the Greeks accomplished many centuries earlier in terms of a philosophical rendering of reality, and this, I came to believe, is due to language. I also came to believe that it was not an accident that the New Testament was written in such a precise language as Greek. I was learning now both languages and their histories, their capacities and their achievements. Moreover, until the age of the Church, and only after several centuries' worth of reflection, Latin writers had had a difficult time portraying history. It is a curious thing, then, that Latin has survived beyond Greek. Of course, I don't mean modern Greek, which would be better compared to Italian or Romanian. And Latin has refined itself, initially by imitation of Greek, later by the ingeniousness of its own capabilities. But, I wondered, why and how is it that a specific language can lend itself to better or worse expressions of reality? Something that always surprises students of Greek and is still so fascinating to me is that besides the active voice, for example, the father releases the son, and the passive voice, such as the son is released by the father, classical Greek has within itself another voice called the middle voice. Think for a moment on what this could possibly mean. Another voice, not active and yet not passive, and mysteriously called the middle voice. You can almost picture something in between the active and passive, but what is it? My wondering about this alone was fruitful. Maybe not when I first encountered this grammar element as a student, but later, when I was searching for the middle voice in my New Testament. The middle voice is, most basically, the subject acting in its own interest. If you have ever studied Latin, for example, in each textbook there is always a modal verb that is used to expose all the forms. We might have amo, I love, as the modal verb. Amo is active, and by the addition of one simple letter, amor is formed and means I am loved. But how could you say, I love for my own interest, with a single word? The answer is, you cannot. In every Greek textbook, the modal verb, due to its simplicity and regularity, is luo, which means I loose or I release. Passively, it means I am loosed or I am released. However, in the middle voice, it means I loose for my own interest. In other words, I ransom. Again, I think I went to, yeah. There is more to it, but obviously, but to spare you all the technicalities, I'd ask you to simply consider the effect this revelation had upon my thinking. The fact that one language can do something that another, perhaps all others, cannot, was mind-boggling to my inquiring mind. I wondered, were the Greeks such great philosophers due to their language? Was the capability for such high philosophy simply embedded in their language? And this brought me to finally valuing German. You see, I originally had no interest in learning German for the sake of speaking the language. I only wanted to read some important books that have not been translated into English. You see, the Germans dominated the humanities, I would argue, for at least 3 centuries. In philosophy and theology in particular, it seemed to me that they owned all the great ones of the modern period. Some Germans, at least some German theologians I personally know, still say if you don't study in Germany, you don't study at all. In Göttingen, where I wrote my dissertation and lived for nearly a decade, there exists a plaque that reads in Latin, Extra Göttingam non est vita, si es vita non est ita, which sounds much smoother in Latin than in English, and it means outside of Göttingen there is no life. If there is life, it's not like this. But where did they get such confidence? And no one disputes the countless great scholarly achievements the Germans have made, and the countless great scholars they produced. Were they, I wondered, like the Greeks before them, better positioned to engage abstract concepts which could be made real and solid simply due to their language? As my studies in Germany were solely in the realm of the humanities, I'd have to say that yes, German was in many ways better suited for the task at hand than English. Think of the way German can form new ideas by stacking words together to make one singular concept. We Americans might laugh when we see a ridiculously long word in German, such as their word for speed limit, which is Geschwindigkeitsbegrenzung. But I'll give you a clearer example from the game of chess, where I'm told that English speakers use a German word to express a situation wherein a player is forced to move a piece to his own disadvantage. This is called simply Zugzwang. Zug meaning move, and Zwang meaning compulsion to do something. We have no word for this, and rather than weakening the meaning with something such as forced move, or making it intolerable with forced move to one's own disadvantage, the entire concept is understood and conveyed with the simple German term Zugzwang. Perhaps you can imagine, then, how this flexibility mixed with precision might lend itself to the humanities, where the Germans could develop new philosophical avenues by a combination of words and ideas, rather than by borrowing them from other languages, thereby losing something in translation. My degree from Germany is in History and Literature of Ancient Christianity. However, the German title doesn't use the corresponding German word Historie for history, but rather Geschichte. There is a distinction between the two German words that mean history, Geschichte and Historie. And this distinction is ultimately very fascinating. Geschichte means story. So the Geschichte of ancient Christianity is shot through with meaning in the German title in such a way that cannot be truly conveyed in English. It is more than Historie, which is impersonal and confines itself to recounting lifeless facts about the past. Geschichte has embedded within it a living connection to the subject, which, when the subject is the church itself, is wonderfully illuminating. For Geschichte is speaking about a felt reality which is still present. It is a connection to the same spirit which animates past and present experiences alike. In English, we only have history, and there is no deeper meaning. If I could, I would change the title, the English title, of my degree to The Story and Books of the Ancient Church. That's how I approach my studies, as a member of the story, the Geschichte. I drank deeply from the German well, or Quelle, but could not fully bring the depth and clarity of those waters with me. There is always something lost in translation, and it is all the more unfortunate when the translator knows it, knows that it's happening, yet cannot do anything about it. But eventually there came a point during my decade abroad when I realized that I could bring some of the goods of the other worlds or other languages I was frequenting into my own context and insert them like little vehicles of meaning into my writing. You've all likely seen something similar when you're reading a book and suddenly encounter quotations from other languages. Writers that are at home in another language often do this, I assume, so they don't lose anything in translation, knowing that they are at least doing justice to the original author and hoping that their restraint from translating will speak to someone someday. My most notable experience with this wasn't a use of a quotation, but it was an arduous expansion of my mind via much criticism that brought me to a new and original concept. When I was working on my dissertation, I was learning about what is called process theology. I was analyzing the creation of the church as an unfolding event in history, and kept wanting to locate the center of that event at the cross and resurrection of Christ. But each time I would say the center of the event, there would be confusion. No one understood what I was getting at. I was strongly critiqued, most notably by my wife, for my lack of clarity on this point. My phrasing was indeed not clear. Anyone who read what I wrote during this period thought that I was placing the death of Jesus at the chronological center. And I couldn't make it clear that I wasn't talking at all about chronology. Even now, I can't explain without the word I adopted from Greek, namely kairos. You see, Greek has two words for time, chronos and kairos. Chronos is what we think of when we think of time in English, the hourglass relentlessly dropping one grain of sand at a time. But kairos means the right time or the appropriate time. So I immediately solved the issue as soon as I called the center the kairotic center rather than just the center. Without going into all the details, I'm sure you can imagine now what I mean. It is the right time and has nothing at all to do with chronos. And so after years of effort, I was finally reaping the rewards of language study. I could now read anything I desired and also began pursuing larger issues than those contained in mere word study. I felt more like a dual citizen than a tourist, but I had only begun to realize that there was another level which is achievable. The last step, or should I say the most unexpected step, in this adventure is only now fully manifesting. It is none other than appreciating the languages for themselves, or rather, to be able to think inside a language without translating into English. To be sure, I still mistrust myself when harping on why the Latin text of the Edict of Milan is as beautiful as anything I've seen in Ovid. But there is certainly something in the way that a classical language can leave you uplifted and truly edified when grasped in the full range of experiences and encounters that can only come after years of struggling with the grammar and slow apprehension of the text. In English, we tend to place all the important information at the beginning of a sentence. Subject, verb, object. I see the ball. Perhaps this is why we interrupt so frequently, because we know what someone is saying after just a few words. But there is a freedom of word order in Latin and in Greek, which, to the experienced, can often leave one in awe of the writers, and we dare not interrupt them. German, too, varies from English in that the most important verb very often falls at the complete end of a sentence. One has to become malleable and often able to suspend judgment until the very last word of a very long sentence. In making a home in a language, I learned to listen and to reserve judgment until after thoroughly grasping and reflecting upon what has been said. I give you this example from the master Cicero, from his third oration against Catiline. Rem publicum quirites vitamque omnium vestrum bona fortunas coniuges liberosque vestros arque hoc domicilium clarissime imperii fortunatissimam pulcherrimamque urbem hodierno die deorum immortalium sumo erga vos amore laboribus consiliis periculis meis e flamma arque ferro ac pene ex faucibus fati reptam et vobis conservatam ac restitutam videtis. Here there are 46 words before the verb, which falls dead last. Students often ask whether or not the Romans would have been able to follow this. The answer is yes, and so can you. But you have to listen and be flexible, just like they did and were. You cannot interrupt. Cicero evokes the citizens of Rome in the third word. They know he's talking to them, but they have no idea what he's going to say until the 47th word. The citizens hear a long string of words in the accusative. That is, words that are the objects of the main verb. Citizens use something, all these words. The republic and the life of each of you, the goods, the fortunes, your spouses and your children. Where is he going with this? What will he say? And this domicile of the most famous empire, the most fortunate and most beautiful city. Yes, he's mentioning everything. We get it. But what is he getting at? On this day, by the great love of the immortal gods towards you, by my labors, my plans, and my dangers. Uh-oh, this could be bad. Please don't let it be bad. From the flames and the sword, and nearly from the jaws of fate. Oh, good, he said nearly. Maybe it's not bad. All these things snatched away and preserved and restored to you. And here's the last word on which everything hangs: you see. Now and only now can it be worked around and made understandable in English. Citizens, you see the Republic, the life of each of you, etc., by the love of the immortal gods, etc., by my labors, etc., all these things snatched away from the flames and the sword, and nearly from the jaws of fate. You see them preserved and restored to you. To be at home in a language, however, is not to switch it into an English translation. It is, rather, to merely let it exist as it is and to appreciate it for what it is. I don't know whether or not one always translates, maybe even subconsciously, to their own first language, but my suspicion, based on my own experience, is that some do not. Overcoming that fateful step of translating is one of the greatest rewards in language studies. For modern languages, it is overcome more quickly, as I believe, because you can hear the voices of others in your head and simply repeat without translating. For the classical languages of Greek and Latin, where it is nearly impossible to join a community of speakers, it is much more difficult. You have to spend countless hours in books, and yet the reward is incredibly wonderful. To make a language my own, as my professor had wisely advised so many years before, took a new mindset. In patience we rise. There was no beating my head against the wall, but simply slowing down to hear what the writer had to say. Often in Latin, we teachers proclaim that word order doesn't matter. That is true on a certain level, but when reading real Latin texts, of course, word order matters. To appreciate the language for what it is, one needs to let it speak just the way it is found. Just as making a home in a foreign country takes a good measure of patience and willingness to yield to foreign modes and customs, so too does making a home in a foreign language. Sometimes, and this may seem strange, it is when I'm falling asleep reading a text late at night that I'm reminded of this need for yielding to a language. The first time this happened was so startling to me that I told my students about it the next day. I was dozing off while reading the play Adelphi by Terence when I came across this line. Venit ad me sepe clamans quid agis micio. It was as if I didn't read it at all, but merely heard it spoken, and very loudly. He comes to me often shouting, "What are you doing, Micio?" It's a simple line, even in Latin, but the experience represents for me a breakthrough. I had heard the language, and there was no struggle for understanding. In my fatigue, I had yielded. Perhaps some of you will know similar experiences if you've ever dreamt in a foreign language. The language will never give in to you. You must give in to it, and letting go is much harder than it might seem. So to conclude, whether you are a language tourist, engaged primarily in word study and vocabulary and grammar forms, or if you are a long-term resident, a translator, a speaker, an imitator, who is always improving your vocabulary and grammar, or if you are a citizen of another language, no longer translating, but thinking in that language, I encourage you to keep on developing your skills.